Elite Facts presents
8 classic horror films from before 1970. The horror genre, probably one of the more abused film genres of our time. I mean, come on, in this day and age, all we get are 20 Paranormal Activity sequels, a million crappy remakes, and a ton of bargain bin DVDs starring some of our favorite actors who are out of work. Because of this, we always tend to look to the past and see what made the genre so popular to begin with. Well, that's exactly what this list is about. However, we're going to avoid the obvious 1980s and 90s boom of horror films. That's too easy. Instead, we're giving ourselves a cutoff point of 1970. Here's our 8 classic horror films that were released before the 1970s. Before we get into this list, we need to stress the fact that a lot of Universal monster films will be appearing on this list. I mean, they did popularize the genre after all. And let's get started. 8. Black Sunday. You may remember this from our list of Italian horror films you need to watch. Well, this film is good enough to make it here too, and considering the lineup following this film, that's quite an achievement. So this film was released back in 1960 and was directed by Mario Bava. The plot to Black Sunday, otherwise known as The Mask of Satan and Revenge of the Vampire, revolves around a witch who was also a vampire who was executed over 200 years ago. Princess Asa Vajda is then resurrected when 2 travelers, Professor Thomas Kruvajan and Dr. Andrei Gorobek, accidentally disturb her abandoned tomb. At the time of her execution, the princess swore vengeance against her accuser, her brother, and all of his descendants. She quickly resurrects her lover and turns Kruvajan into her vampire servant. When she learns that the present-day Princess Katia is identical to her, she sets out to get control of the young woman. This film is without a doubt one of the most atmospheric films, not only just on this list, but one of the most atmospheric films in the horror genre in general.
7.
Dracula. Okay, how could we not mention Dracula? This film is quintessential for both horror fans and general film fanatics. This film stars Bela Lugosi as the man himself, Count Dracula, in what would be the character's first of many on-screen appearances. As much as we like Gary Oldman, let's forget what he looked like in that 2000 film. Anyway, the film centers around an estate agent by the name of Renfield who travels to Transylvania to complete a real estate transaction with Count Dracula. Unbeknownst to Renfield, however, despite warnings of evil by some of the locals, Dracula is a vampire, and the visitor is soon his unwilling servant. They travel by ship to England, but by the time it makes port, an insane Renfield is the only living passenger. Count Dracula moves into Carfax Abbey and immediately sets out to possess the beautiful Mina, who lives next door. It's left to Professor Van Helsing, who knows exactly what Dracula is, to stop the spread of his evil.
6.
White Zombie, 1932. Ever wondered what the zombie subgenre was before Night of the Living Dead? I mean, we always hear the term Romero zombie. So what were the undead like before we got to see Romero's first outing? Well, best example we could probably give you is White Zombie from 1932. The film centers around a young couple, Madeline and Neil, who are coaxed by an acquaintance, Monsieur Beaumont, to get married on his Haitian plantation. Beaumont's motives are purely selfish as he makes every attempt to convince the beautiful young girl to run away with him. For help, Beaumont turns to the devious Legendre, a man who runs his mill by mind-controlling people he has turned into zombies. After Beaumont uses Legendre's zombie potion on Madeline, he's dissatisfied with her emotionless being and wants her to be changed back. Legendre has no intention of doing this, and he drugs Beaumont as well to add to his zombie collection. Meanwhile, grieving widower Neil is convinced by a local priest that Madeline may still be alive, and he seeks her out. Even if it's not what you're used to, it's still fun to see what the zombie film looked like before Romero jumped into the scene.
5.
The Mummy, 1932. Look, we like Brendan Fraser too, okay? We don't know what happened to him, but can we please stop calling his incarnation of the Mummy the original? That itself was a remake of the Boris Karloff film from way back in the 1920s. This film, along with Dracula, are quintessential pieces of horror that are must-watches for any horror fans out there. During a British Museum-sponsored archaeological expedition to Egypt led by Sir Joseph Wemple, the recently discovered mummy of a high priest, Imhotep, comes to life and walks away into the desert night. 10 years later, a new expedition led by Sir Joseph's son, Frank Wemple, finds the tomb of Princess Ankh-es-Enemon, Imhotep's long-lost love. In order to revive her completely, Imhotep requires Helen Grosvenor to die so he can revive her and make her a living mummy like himself. The Mummy films have certainly taken a more action-oriented approach with the recent reboots and sequels. If you're looking for something that's more horror-oriented but maintains the ancient Egyptian tones, definitely watch this if you haven't already.
4,
Night of the Living Dead, 1968. Okay, much like any of the previously mentioned Universal horror films, Night of the Living Dead needs no introduction whatsoever. This film single-handedly resurrected, well, no pun intended, the zombie subgenre, while at the same time also recreating it. George A. Romero and John A. Russo both collaborated on writing the script, and George himself directed the whole film, and needless to say, this film is an absolute masterpiece in terms of horror. This film stars Dwayne Jones as Ben and Judith Deer as Barbara, and to sum up the entire film, it's just a group of survivors attempting to survive the night in a farmhouse surrounded by a large horde of the undead who want nothing more than to chomp down on their flesh. Speaking about the hordes of the undead, this was the main thing that Romero and Russo changed when it came to the zombie genre. If you remember previously when talking about White Zombie, the zombies in this film were just mindless humans who were under control by the devil to do their will. Instead, these creatures were shambling corpses who wanted nothing more but to consume the flesh of the living. Quite a far cry from the original concept, right? Well, it turns out a lot of people preferred this representation of the zombie that it ended up becoming a staple of the genre. The film released to critical acclaim and is considered a crown jewel of the horror genre as a whole. Unfortunately for Romero and Russo, as it was their first major outing as writers and directors, the film was considered as public domain, and it didn't make a single penny from its box office take and VHS, Laserdisc, DVD, and Blu-ray releases. Both Romero and Russo would go on respectively to continue the franchise in their own direction, as George created a direct sequel to Night of the Living Dead with Dawn of the Dead, and Russo created a whole new line of films that uses Night of the Living Dead as a reference point in his Return of the Living Dead films.
3,
Frankenstein, 1931. Look at that, another Universal monster film, and this is probably going to be a controversial opinion here, but it's probably our favorite Universal monster film of the lot. Now, don't get us wrong, we love all of them, but we think that Frankenstein from 1931 is probably the best of the series. The plot centers around Dr. Henry Frankenstein as he attempts to play God and creates a monster from various dead donors and combines them into a massive creature to whom he wishes to bestow life. The movie centers on this monster and his struggle in this life after death. If you've not seen this film, who are we kidding, most horror fans have, but if not, watch it.
2,
The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, 1920. Okay, so for most film fanatics out there, you'll probably have done your research and know about this film. However, we don't think many people watching this will even know what this film is or what it's about, and that's perfectly fine. It's an obscure choice, after all. Anyway, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is a German expressionist horror film from 1920. At a fair in the village of Holstenwald, Dr. Caligari obtains a permit to set up his tent show featuring Cesar, the 23-year-old somnambulist who has slept for 23 years. Francis and his friend Alan visit the popular show, and Alan asks Cesar in his trance-like state to tell him his future. Cesar predicts that he will die that night, and when Alan is in fact found dead in the morning, it seems to be just one of many such crimes recently. Francis is determined to find his friend's killer, all the more so after Cesar tries to kidnap his fiancée. He follows him to an insane asylum, but not all is as it seems. Now, okay, we'll admit this film probably won't scare anyone nowadays and has aged drastically, but to be fair, this film is almost 100 years old, so it's expected. However, we do recommend this for the simple fact that the cinematography alone is pretty fantastic for the time it was made.
1,
Psycho, 1960. Alfred Hitchcock is an absolute genius. He is the master of suspense. He earned that title with films such as The Birds, Rear Window, and Vertigo. However, it's almost safe to say that his crowning achievement has to be the always classic film Psycho from 1960. The film follows Marion Crane, a woman who, the day before, had stolen $40,000 from her employee's client, packed her bags, and driven all day on the way to join her paramour several hundred miles away. Now, she's taking a relaxing hot shower after her long day's journey. The remoteness of the motel suits her purposes perfectly. The only sounds heard are the chirping of the crickets, the splashing of the water, and her humming contentedly as the hot needles of water caress her aching shoulders. And that's our list. We know we're probably missing plenty of other classic horror films from this list, but hey, we'd be here all week if we were to talk about all of them, so please let us know in the comments below what your favorite classic horror films are. And thanks for watching.
Don't forget to like us and subscribe for more Elite Facts.